Hello, everyone, and welcome to What is Cosmic Intelligence, Part 10. And Part 10 is a good place to do kind of a summation or synthesis of the previous episodes to kind of get the connective tissue nourished so that we can perhaps understand. Excuse me. But I'm here with my best buddy and co-conspirator, Douglas Gabriel from American Intelligence Media. Douglas, how you doing there?
Well, I'm doing great. That's amazing that we're still alive and we're
Can you raise the volume a little bit?
I guess I could try. It
Yeah.
sounds technical to me, but all right. How's this? I'll get closer to the microphone.
Yeah.
So thanks for inviting me today. I know I'm filling in for a slot, but I can't fill in for Christopher Earl Struck because he's one and only in the entire universe. I think aliens come here to just observe his behavior, as a matter of fact. And you were going to interview him today. So yes, carrying on our 10th installment on the most difficult subject ever created in philosophical or theological consideration. So yeah, I think we need a summary.
Yeah, and I normally would be doing my show with Reverend David William Perry out of London, and now that he's Archbishop of the Catholic Church of Antioch, that's quite a wonderful thing for him. So I offer my congratulations to him whenever he gets around to watching our humble efforts here. And so he told me, because time change wasn't working out, we did a time change here. Now it's daylight time, and so you spring forward and fall back. And so we sprung forward, and it made it too early for him to show up. And so I thought I'd get Christopher Strunk again, and I couldn't get a hold of him in time. And Douglas, just out of the blue, happened to call me. So I asked if he could come on. And so basically what you did is what you have here is you'll have an opportunity to kind of eavesdrop on an ongoing 50-year conversation. So here we go.
Yes, and the Reverend and Chris are, they're unparalleled. It's wonderful what you do with them. And what we're doing is very interesting because in a way, it's kind of like what we're doing over at Aim for Truth, which is our spirit, which is also on Gab under Gabriel_Horn, where my wife and her team, Tyla or Betsy, you might know her as, or Frigg, she has many names. We're doing a thing called the Akasha series. And as we have been doing these 10, I have been doing a variety of kind of supplemental statements that we basically said, we're going to just directly talk to people who know that they've had that golden moment of illumination. They've had the preparation, and then they had the moment of illumination, or the basically what you'd call the moment of enlightenment. And then now they're on their own path, a path of initiation. And that's what we're trying to give out to people. And so we have handled kind of a philosophical, theological, anthroposophical, and Western Christian esoteric tradition approach to this in these talks. And we got a whiteboard so that we could, keep up with the neighbors, and started putting down all this cosmological stuff and finding that people really enjoyed it. So in a way, this conversation has spurred a new creation over there at Our Spirit is where you'll find those, or there's a YouTube channel for it that just have these spiritual talks. And I believe that we also always post the talks that we've had, these 10 that we've had, later. And underneath them, I've always put notes, but there won't be notes today. And if you take those notes and you put them all together, it'll give you a summary of the 10 talks we've had. And I like to give a lot of supporting material because I like to talk about things that are out there on the edge. And when people hear you talking about them, they may think you're nuts unless you, in fact, back it up with statements from good authorities. So today, if we're talking about a summary of the I am, with the most difficult subject you could have given me, which is great because we could discuss this forever. It's the number one question. The oldest philosophical and religious question is basically, in the Upanishads, it would say, Brahman is outside of us, Atman is inside of us, and the two are one. I mean, that's a very simple American distillation of it, but that's what we're talking about here. Rudolf Steiner says in Knowledge of Our Worlds that the world, your I am, and the world seem to be completely separate, but we must create a bridge so that they can become united. And when you do that, it's the same exact philosophical conundrum that you have to solve that has been asked since the beginning of recorded time. As soon as anyone started writing things down, that's what they would write down, because they'd have that objective experience of the I am looking at themselves. And they'd say, wait a second, if the I am, if my consciousness, my ego, myself, whatever you want to call it, is looking at myself and it's having feelings, and myself is doing even actions, and I'm completely objective. I'm like above it. They describe this as objective viewing now in modern parlance. So if you get to the point of having objective viewing and you can look down and you can basically think about your thinking, or think about the fact that you have thinking, feeling, and willing, well, there you go. That's the beginning. And then we have discussed in these talks the most amazing, humble attempt at trying to describe the biography of the human I am. And you can't do that without talking about the Christ's I am, and the distinction between Christ in you, and as you develop, is that you or is that Christ? And there again, is it the world? Is it Brahman? Is it God? Or is it myself? And that question, we can't ever give a final answer on that. All we can do is point out the amazing, what would you call it, auspiciousness that we have in Rudolf Steiner's work to give us the most full description of what the I am is, where it came from, what it's doing now, and what it's going to do in the future. And that gives you a cosmological view that you can't get anywhere else. And that's what we've been discussing. So we could, in a while, maybe I'll give a summary of the 10 talks in terms of the highlights, the headlines. But basically, to discuss this, especially in a summary fashion or off the cuff, we could go anywhere with this, Mr. Barnwell. So the ball's in your court.
Well, I knew you'd sidestep a little bit because this is so spontaneous. And so anytime I do any of these podcasts, I kind of let serendipity lead the charge. And I find that, well, Douglas is familiar with the way I work, and books will fall open at certain pages, and that will give me the topic for the next chapter. So that's kind of the way I roll. And it's an interesting way because it keeps me integrated to the world outside of which Douglas is making reference to, because there is this whole overlighting beingness that we participate in. And if you're a student of Rudolf Steiner, then you know that in earlier stages of evolution of mankind, that we dwelled within a tribal consciousness, and earlier than that, even it was a totally integrated consciousness of all mankind, as far as the understanding of the donation of that fourth principle in the human being, which is the ego, which is the aspect of an individual. There's one word that describes it, and you can only use that word for one thing, and that's I. And when you say I, you don't mean, when I say I, I'm not meaning Douglas, I'm meaning this I. Yeah, he has his own point of reference too, But it's interesting because if you go back to the 4th century of Greek descent, bishop who converted the Goths in Northern Europe, his name was Ulfilas or Wolfilas. And he was the first one to create a written Bible in Europe. And so you have it's called the Silver Bible. It has an interesting provenance to it too, because it has a repeated appearance throughout history in significant events. But before I get into any of that, you have to understand that he was the guy who codified language and created the Gothic alphabet, so to speak. And when he did that, he created a word that represents I, and it's the prototype of the German word for I, which is ich, which is the letter I, the letter C, and the letter H. And so in Ulfilas's I, you have the initials of Jesus Christ. And so it's important to understand that was a real key within his mission, and that he was capable of being received into Gothic culture, which had already gone through a declining phase that led the Northern Europeans to come to the whole mythic concept, so to speak, of their end times for Northern Viking culture and the culture of the Trottans and the culture of the Northern Celts and all of that there was this kind of culmination, that they were in a period of waiting, that there was a new impulse coming, and that they were particularly situated to be able to receive that impulse in a very unique way, because they did not have a developed intellectual culture, which is why somebody like Ulfilas had to come along and take their language and put it into a written form with the Gothic alphabet that he created. And so you see that's a very significant thing, because Rudolf Steiner talks about how it's because of this lack of intellectual culture that they were such a fertile planting place of the Christ impulse, because there was a capability to receive a new impulse, because the street wasn't already full. There was plenty of territory to be developed within Northern European culture. And they had a backstory that would enable them to have a very unique approach towards understanding this, because basic Northern mysteries centered around 12 representatives surrounding a 13th, which is like the 12 signs of the zodiac, or the 12 apostles, or the 12 tribes of Israel, or the 12 edges on a cube. So it's a very cosmic representation. And anytime in scripture where you see numbers, it's an important thing, the number they're talking about. And the number 12 is very significant in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. But you see, within the Northern European culture, you had the 12 representing the 12 archetypal aspects. The 13th was the leader. And the problem with that system in the North is if the leader's not a nice guy, if he's some kind of despot, you're in a world of hurt. And that often was the case. And you'll see that kind of struggle that's even represented in the Oralinda book, for example, that was published in the 1800s and translated from Frisian. While it is controversial, the fact of that the context of those writings and the way in which they looked at the world is a very unique perspective. And when you carry it also within the work of Richard Wagner in his operas, that he took this impulse that's the ancient northern impulse. Rudolf Steiner said is that the teacher that was the central impulse was an initiate named Sigga or Siegfried, and it's the mysteries of Sigga and Frigga. You know, the Sigga is the male and Frigg, she's the female. And so, but with Sigga or Sigurd or Siegfried, with that impulse, what you have is a musical mystery. And so it's referred to by the Greeks as the Hyperborean impulses, that Apollo would come down once a year to the shrines in Greece and bring that northern impulse. But it's a musical impulse. But the northern music is based on string music, whereas with the Dionysian stream, in opposition to that Apollonian, the Dionysian stream has to do with woodwinds. You know, it's like Pan with his panpipes, right? So that's a different thing. And so you have this mystery of the breath that's revealed through those mysteries of Dionysius and the Old Testament, for that matter. I mean, what does it say in the Old Testament? He breathed life into them. But yet in the northern mysteries, it has to do with this whole idea of the insertion of the will. And so it's more of an active element, whereas the breathing thing is more of a passive, allowing the divine. You know, it's that mystery of the priesthood, whereas the mysteries of like Hiram and the mysteries of the craft have to do with working with your hands. And you have, today's the 10th episode, and we have 10 fingers. At least almost all of us have 10 fingers. I have met people that had 11, and there are some unfortunate souls that have less than 10, and God bless them. But in any regard, so when you get into this whole mystery of the strings, and which led ultimately in this northern music mystery shrines, what did it culminate in? And it came into the tremendous orchestral music of the classical composers, Beethoven, and Bach, and Mozart, and all the others throughout Europe. But it's that high point of culture. And then when you go to an individual like Richard Wagner, and you look at his actual path of exploration, he saw that there had to be a bridge developed between the different arts to get to a more powerful impulse. So he took the ancient myths of the North, and he combined them with the orchestral impulses from Beethoven and the poetic impulses from William Shakespeare, and the architectural impulses that came out of the Gothic Templar stream, and brought all of them together. And so that's a very significant thing that people in America are almost entirely oblivious to.
Well, you're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, I thought you were going to say the mystery word that always gets me the most excited because you talked about it so much, and that's Scythionus. You talked about Fresians and that book that so recently came to light because Cliff High brought it forward, saying that it's true. Well, look at what the Fresians said, and they were real and they're quite historic. They said that Atlantis existed, and they were a matriarchal culture, and they described all of these things of migrations coming from the west, from Atlantis, going across Brittany and Western Europe, and then going further to east, and then eventually coming back. That is the path of Scythionus and the mysteries of the North that you've talked about. So again, as we're talking about the development of the I am, or ego development, it gets so detailed that when you are seeing the manifestation of the folk spirits as they work through nations or tribes, or literally, as you just pointed out, from somewhat of an archetypal collective group soul in a way, to tribes to then being led by tribal leaders because of strength or the ability to successfully create agriculture or food in one way or the other. And then it became, with settled cultures, the priest kings. And we were led by priest kings. And those priest kings were after the matriarchal rule, which had existed in all of Neolithic and ancient Europe as a universal, ubiquitous manifestation of the threefold goddess of birth, death, and rebirth. So we have to look that human beings in time have a historical development of the ego. And in the past, we were much more dependent upon these priest kings or these great master beings or beings like Manu, who wrote the laws of Manu that created India, Zarathustra that created the Gathas and the sacred writings of the Persians, or Hermes or Moses. These great beings were, in fact, being vessels for higher beings, and so they weren't in the way that we would look at it completely just a human being. They were in a direct connection to higher beings in the spiritual hierarchy, which we've talked about, because that's where we're all going to evolve to. But we're not going to devolve. We're not going to go back to the original matriarchal culture, and we're not going to stay in this patriarchal culture, and we're not just going to become an amorphous, asexual driven culture of the future. We're going to evolve to higher realms. And as we do, the ego, the I am, needs new archetypes. And we no longer have priest kings. We no longer have priestesses in the temples. We no longer have the mystery centers. We no longer have people who are in direct connection to the spiritual world and give us revelation. It is incumbent upon us to do that. And so if you've prepared, if you've had the golden moment of illumination or that flash of enlightenment, and you're on the path of initiation, then the best thing you can do is to study basically your ancestors, the history of how human thinking came to be, how that objective thinking about thinking came to be, what philosophers said about it. And when you do all that work down here in the physical plane, it creates muscles that can actually begin to see the universal laws inherent in the shadow of the spirit manifested in the physical world. And those very capacities can be translated and transferred into transcendental experiences beyond the threshold between the physical and the spiritual. And that's what we keep talking about. But to do this, you get into realms that are just wild. But let's just for a moment take the modern perspective. Please tell me any scientific theory that has lasted more than 100 years. Now, let me just tell you a couple that have come about, and they've come about because of the Voyager 1 and 2 reaching the outer heliosphere of our, which is shaped like an egg, by the way, or like a mother's stomach, a belly, womb, holding a child, like a comet. And so we've now found that the solar winds go out to the heliosphere, and then they basically are reflected back to a degree. But when they reach it, and that happened not too long ago when Voyager 2 stopped transmitting, and then later, Voyager 1, and then later Voyager 2, when they reached this sphere, one of them reaching the northern, what they call the northern axis of it, the whole, I would call it the amniotic sac of the sun, and inside of it, the magnetosphere and the solar wind goes out to a certain point and more or less stops. And when they reached it, it was 180 degrees Fahrenheit, 180,000 degrees Fahrenheit, excuse me. And so some of the machinery stopped working, some permanently in these. And remember, they're not really sending us anything more than zeros and ones. It's the way we interpret it. But when they reached this, they said, oh my goodness, we have to now reconstruct everything we know about the sun, our solar system, the limits of our solar system, what we think we know, everything that we thought we knew, it seems as if then sun replicates the solar wind, reaches a certain terminal place, and most of it is turned around and sent back in another form, an invisible form. So as we know, when you reach these outer limits, the Kuiper belt, or when you reach the Oort cloud, where comets come out of from nowhere and they manifest and go around the sun and then go back out to the Oort cloud and disappear again. So now they have reached what they call the limits of the heliosphere and the troposphere. So all of the effects of the sun reach a certain limit that we were shocked that we were able to get beyond. And then beyond that, of course, is interstellar space. And really, basically, according to what they believe, nothingness for about the rest of all of humanity's existence, if we were to wait for the Voyager to tell us anything. So here we reach the limit of our solar system, and what do we find? Everything we thought we knew has to be trash canned. But that's the settled science that we all believe in, that gives us our medicine, that heals us and gives us everything. Science is so wonderful. It settles all of my questions that I have. There's always a new scientific. Oh, that's right. Science doesn't settle anything ever. That's the nature of it. And if we believe in it, then that's believing in a new papacy. That's believing in the Pope of science. So what I'm trying to say here is, whether you want to look at the motion of the sun and the way the planets follow behind, which we've discussed, I think, here before, or if you want to look at where the real center of mass is, or whether you want to look at, does the speed of light in a continuum go faster than the frontal motion of the speed of light, or all of these questions Rudolf Steiner answered in his astronomy course, and he gave us these indications that are amazing. And what it shows in every case is that we should learn to be very humble beings that should acknowledge the fact that we've only began to learn who we are, whether it's inside of ourselves in the I am, or whether it's in the world. We only have begun to scratch the surface. And what you brought up there could be a whole other topic with Scythianus and the way that is transferred through music, because until writing, all those northern mysteries and all those northern nations, all the way from Atlantis, all the way to Siberia, and even into America, they didn't write anything down. And the earmark of that culture, which then, as it came all the way back to the West, as we would call them Scythians, or later Sarmatians, or some would even call them Celts, but all these migrating Eastern people who had been led by Scythianus, every one of those nations and tribes had a way to sing an epic. And that epic, in most cases, was in pseudo-hexameter or hexameter. And this goes right on through to the Greeks. And so you see Scythianus was trying to balance the breath and the heartbeat, 1 to 4, which is what pseudo-hexameter does very beautifully, whether you're looking at the Kalavala or the Poetic Edda, or many of these northern mystery stream epics. They weren't written down. They were all basically a verbal lineage that taught these things. And when you look at them, you will find a lot of the similar archetypes. But what is most important is, in our time, what Rudolf Steiner said we should be looking at to help our ego develop in the proper way is the Kalavala of the Finnish culture, which is a Finno-Uric derived language, which goes all the way, its sources go all the way to eastern and the furthest northern part of Siberia, where Scythianus went. So you get to see in these languages, not the Indo-Aryan language is one thing, but when you get into the Finnish Uric, and Rudolf Steiner says, study then the Kalavala, those are the mysteries of the I am right now. That is how you develop what Rudolf Steiner calls the consciousness soul into the higher aspect of the consciousness soul called the spiritual soul. And the Kalavala balances your breath and heartbeat as it is balanced when you are asleep. So when you're asleep, it's 1 to 4 breaths generally, if you're a healthy person. So if you could imagine that as they are sitting in their gathering places in all these northern mysteries and northern countries, literally reciting what Scythianus put into verse for them as their beliefs. And those beliefs came through their dreams, they came through visions, they came through revelations, but those northern people were the last ones to write anything down, so therefore they had a connection to the spiritual world and what Rudolf Steiner calls a natural clairvoyance. So we can learn the greatest amount from the people who could still see into that spiritual world in the most recent time in history. And that would be the Finnish people, who are a remarkable people. And there's no end to the depth of what that reference is about, because you study the Kalavala and you study the threefold nature of the soul and the nature of the spirit and also the nature of the I am and your place in it. And it's basically it's a cosmological, mythological fairy tale that shows you the component parts of your being and what it is you're striving for and what the results would be if you got them. And literally, I cannot praise high enough the fact that Steiner has given us this as a source of nourishment to feed our spirit in this time.
Yeah, so Madame Blavatsky, she mentioned that the Crawford translation is the best English translation of the Kalavala that she knew of at that time. And yeah, it's a wonderful, for those that aren't as ambitious, well, you could just go to Goethe's fairy tale of the green snake and the beautiful lily, and that will give you a nice imaginal representation of this particular context that we're pointing at. And it's important to understand that we're looking at this and we're giving you tools for your toolbox, so to speak, but it has to do with artistry. It's the artisan that is the one who gives the future, right? That it comes from the artists. That Rudolf Steiner was very clear, and I've said this too many times, forgive me for saying it again, but art is higher than philosophy. And so the arts come out of that realm, and that's why the North is so compatible with the impulse of the artists, because they did not develop an intellectual culture like down in Greece and Rome, and they were all very sophisticated, have all kinds of lawyers, and everything was codified, and there's all this going back, back into the night of time as far as the Mediterranean culture. But in the North, they were still living within the world of dream. The reason they were so happy to go into battle is because they knew that there really is no death, that you just go into the next room as if you were going through a door, and they wanted to go actually to Valhalla and be with their gods, right? And so they have this very kind of tenuous relationship almost to the physical world, but yet tremendous ingenuity. If you look at the structure of a Viking ship, it's absolutely incredible that they could do something like that was so effective, and they could travel in shallow water, and they could go up the rivers up into various places when they went to travel around Europe on their expeditions. But yet they were just wild, like a gang of teenagers running around on a certain level, because it was, for them, it was playful. I mean, it's hard for us to grasp because we just think of it as barbarous, and it was, but for them it was the biggest fun they could have, is to run around marauding, So it's difficult for us to appreciate their culture because of that, because we have such a bias towards creature comforts and this whole idea of living in a world where you can feel as if you already know how the world works, and you can feel comfort and sit there and eat your popcorn and watch the world float by. But as Douglas says, settled science, like, really? I mean, when you consider, even if you just look at the sun, and it has the temperature of the sun is just a few thousand degrees, right? But when you get into the corona of the sun, it's like multiples hotter. So why would the corona be hotter than the sun itself? You know, that really confused your astronomers and scientists. And now when you get into what Douglas is talking about, that there's this tremendous heat band surrounding our solar system, where does that come from? What's the source? You know, like they like to tell you, well, the reason the sun is hot because it's combusting all these gases, you know, that this is like a big nuclear reactor. But if you look at the sun and you see that it's actually more dynamic as far as what it's receiving than what it's putting out, that there's this implosion factor that's the dynamic behind the sun, that it's the streams of etheric energy that are converging at the sun. But that the temptation is to think of that in terms of just energy and all that kind of stuff, when in the reality of spiritual science, it's the activity of beings, that these are beings, and our experience of the world around us is the content of the thoughts of the divine spiritual beings. That's literally where all this stuff came from. These are ideas in the mind of God, so to speak, if you want to generalize it. But it's not just God, it's the whole layers of 9 cosmic beings, the divine spiritual beings, that their divine ideation gives us this world in which we're living. And were we capable of being more than just sense-bound creatures, we'd be able to see those beings that are working behind the scenes. And in the ancient world, although it was a dreamlike consciousness, nonetheless, they could see those beings.
Yes, and the name I couldn't remember. I just looked it up. Termination shock. That's like the 4th name I've heard for this realm that they reached that is so hot, 180,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And then they try to tell us that our little Voyagers got through it. Oh, really? The little flimsy little aluminum piece of whatever that was said how long ago made it through this ring past knot? Well, I don't think so. Here's what I would imagine it as. That's the limit of our solar system. Those are the terminal ends of the wings of seraphim and cherubim and thrones. And there are beings, and they're here to protect us. And they pointed out that the interstellar space comes shooting at it, and when it hits this termination shock limit of our solar system beyond the heliosphere, it turns back a lot of particles and stops the intrusion into our basically alone system. We are alone. We are wrapped with the wings of the mother pelican, and we're underneath them, and we are protected. And we don't know jack. We really haven't even began. It's embarrassing because people won't look, scientists won't look at what is happening. They take their view and they bring it to the observation, and they see what they want to see. And that is literally a settled scientific fact, that the human observer creates what it is that is observed. Okay. And then they start telling you quantum theory, which is all a bunch of nonsense, that things are interconnected, and they separated a particle on one side of the earth and the other, and they affected one, and the other, it affected the other on the other side. Hello? 2 lovers could have proved that to them. All they had to do is look at any 2 people in love, or look at a plant and its master, or a dog and its master. I mean, come on. Yes, space doesn't exist, and their view of time is so limited that I can only imagine that the hierarchy must laugh at us a lot because of our stupidity. To me, it's shocking. But let's go back to what you just said, and it's so true. Here's how little people are conscious even of history, let alone the history of their consciousness. And recently we did one and we talked quite a bit about conscience, the history of conscience. All the great thinkers say it's the greatest thing, but they have very little to say about it. And they barely talk about how it came into existence, what it is, where it's going. But speaking of, well, let us call them the Vikings, the northern folk. Yeah, they didn't write things down, but they could work gold like the Scythians as well as anyone. They could navigate better than anyone. They could see through the fog. They had an uncanny ability, I guess you'd call it an intuition. And they'd say that the Vikings would raid the town or village before the fog had and conquered it before the fog had risen, because they could see through it. Well, everywhere those boats could go, which is everywhere, even shallow rivers, they conquered. I don't know of a time that the Vikings, whether they were called Normans or whether they were called Lombards or whether they were called the Rus. Okay, the Lombards, we'll talk about them, but talk about the Rus. Russia, they went down the rivers and in the Ukraine to Kiev, and the Russians are named after the Rus. So all of that area came to the Rus, to the Vikings, and said, "Will you be our kings?" That's how serious of conquerors these people were. Well, that's in our history. We need to understand that, but we need to understand also what also happened then. The Lombards went all the way down to Venice, picked up the Jewish habit of usury, and became the worst bankers maybe in history. And still to this day are the leftover Lombards, who then went back up through Italy, went through Switzerland, went to northern Germany, went to Holland, and then went to Britain. And so you have this, oh, well, the Rus are still conquering the world. Yes, they are. And so what we're dealing with, if you don't know about the Scythian migration and the way it went and came back, and then you want to talk about what's going on in Ukraine, or you want to talk about Khazarians, or you want to talk about the Hebrew people, if you don't know your history, you're just basically flapping your gums in the wind, because you have to know your history. That's the reason that in the East, your ancestor role was the most sacred thing that your family had. And it was set out because you didn't quite worship it, but it was pretty darn close to worshiping the ancestors, because all that they learned and all they did came into you. And in the past, we had a collective unconscious that was more of a group soul. Now that collective unconscious is not really available to us unless we go into trance or deep states of meditation. But when you do, you have the source of the greatest intuitions, of the greatest spiritual influence happening on the earth that there is, and that's who Scythianus was. Scythianus, Rudolf Steiner said, was the great master of the physical body. And because you brought this up, I'll take it the next step. The next step was told to me recently, was brought to my mind again by Elisabeth and Patrick down in Australia, and pointed out that the raising of the daughter of Jairus, the raising of the youth of Nain, and the raising of Lazarus were really a reference to the ancient Indian, Persian, and Greco and Egypto-Chaldean period, and that then we recapitulate them. Now that's a very long and short of an incredibly complex thing, but the point is, it made me realize that the daughter of Jairus was, according to Rudolf Steiner, the example of what happened when Christ had to heal the physical body. And Scythianus was and is the master of the physical body. And of course, the healing of the youth of Nain was later a very special being that John could talk about. I don't want to get astray on this. And then the third one, of course, the raising of Lazarus, was a super special being, the one that later was not called Lazarus, but was called John the Beloved, the writer of the Apocalypse and the Gospels of John. So what you have here is a redemption of the physical, etheric, and astral bodies of the human being. And that is what we have pointed out is the path of initiation that awakens your higher I am in your soul level, and then that awakens you to your 3 higher spiritual egos, you could call them, or your 3 higher spiritual I ams. And when you reach the ultimate, I have a point here. When you reach the ultimate, you get back to the highest recapitulation at a much higher level and a refined level of what we started off. We're not going to be what we were, which was a group soul, almost like an animal. We're going to be the group soul of Christ, with every individual bringing their particular facet that turns it into the greatest jewel that anyone could ever imagine. And so that process, if we don't understand that process, whether it be, as Rudolf Steiner, the great teacher, showed us physically, it showed us etherically, in the astral realm, in the soul realm, in the spirit realm, how it works physically, where you find the I am. For instance, as we just discussed, the heliosphere and the termination shock, your ego just went all the way out there. So now you can hold the sphere, it's an egg of the entire solar system in your own heart. What an amazing thing. So every time one human being takes an advancement, if the other one follows and gets to the same place in consciousness, then what it brings is an individualized version of a mirror that is a 3D mirror that is broken into pieces, and each of the pieces is a perfect image of the whole. And that's what we're doing. It's so simple, and it's so complicated that I imagine that John and I will be doing the talks on this particular topic probably until the day I croak, So we'll keep trying, and we beg your forgiveness if we fall short.
So you're going to croak. I didn't know you were a frog.
Yes, I croak all the time. I'm like a bullfrog. And as
Yeah,
you know, I've been too close too many times to my good friends on the other side in the spiritual world.
Yeah, that's that French thing. It has to do with the frog, the mystery of the frogs. And
the flap of batrachian feet, I think, is what Brian Lynch called it.
The wet slap of batrachian. Yes, good old Brian David Lynch. Yeah, so in getting this to a point to where somebody can actually include it in their toolbox, so to speak, you need certain provisional understandings in order to be able to enter into these concepts. And one of the most fundamental aspects of that is in understanding that you're here now and that you're a visitor, you're a guest, okay? That's your relationship to your physical body. So don't get so carried away about this bag of bones that you're dragging around with you. I mean, take good care of it like you would take care of a fine automobile, but keep in mind, don't be so attached to it. And for that matter, that whole idea of attachment is a real key. And that Rudolf Steiner he devotes almost a half of a lecture trying to make the point of that if you like things too much or you dislike things too much, that you'll never get to clarity. And so it's far too easy for us to slip into these modalities of thought to where, oh, he's one of those, I don't like them, or he's one of those people that think that way, and therefore I don't like them. And whereas that, if you didn't know that and you just went and had a cup of coffee with them, you probably get along fine. Just because this person tends to accept certain ideas that you don't agree with, it doesn't mean that he can't play tennis really well or is a good golfer. So we're all multifaceted, but if we want to get to that clarity that can ultimately lead to an understanding of reincarnation and karma, you have to get over all that sympathy, antipathy. And Rudolf Steiner said it can be very helpful if you're too attracted to somebody, like say a woman, and you're a man, that you can vision them as if they're like really, really old. And if you have a strong aversion to somebody, then imagine them as if they were just a cute little innocent child, infant, and that you can help compensate for that astral that's going to pull you back. Because mind you, unless you can gain clarity on that level, you can't gain access to the realm of the brow chakra of the spirit self. And that's what's going to give you that kind of mental clarity that enables you to pierce through all the illusions and find out who's actually standing before you in a larger context than that limited perspective that you're enabled to see, because you're really seeing, when you see somebody through the lens of sympathy and antipathy, you're just seeing yourself. I mean, you're just seeing your own personal stuff bouncing back at you. I just wanted to say that because it kind of gets lost, and the shuffle is the important, is to have something in your toolbox that works. And so seeing yourself as a guest and being able to get past the sympathy and the antipathy. Now, as far as what Douglas is saying, it's a very powerful meditation. Aaron Pfeiffer gets into it in his heart lectures. That whole idea of the relationship between the center and the infinite distance, that periphery, the consciousness of the periphery and the consciousness of the center, the consciousness of Brahman and the perspective of Atman, the relationship that's embraced in the Sanskrit phrase tat tvam asi, which means thou art that. And it doesn't mean it like as a metaphor. You really are that. You got to start taking responsibility. You know, I think back to when I was studying Aikido, and the founder of Aikido is Morihei Ueshiba. And when World War II started, he disagreed that there should even be a war at all. And he was the instructor to the emperor. And out of respect to Morihei Ueshiba, the emperor let Ueshiba go into the mountains with his principal students and train with them and just stay away from the whole scenario that was going on with the war. And Ueshiba was a samurai. And when you're a samurai and you're the top samurai in the country, you spend all your time defending yourself against people that want to be the top samurai, right? And there's people that Ueshiba would be asleep and they run into his bed because he had what would be like equivalent to $10,000 reward for anybody that could sneak up on him. And he'd be sleeping and somebody'd sneak into his bedroom at night and he'd stop it. So you're talking about a profound person who has a firm grasp on being human. And why am I mentioning him? Well, see, he always was being challenged by other samurai. And one day this samurai showed up and Master Ueshiba, just set aside his sword and used the forms of samurai just to defend himself. And they fought all afternoon. And then the guy finally took his sword, cut himself, and bowed. Because if a samurai draws his sword, you can't sheath it until there's blood on the sword. I mean, it's a martial culture, right? So he cut himself and put his sword in a bow to Master Ueshiba. And Master Ueshiba went underneath a tree and sat down to meditate. And he said, a golden energy came out of the ground and surrounded him in golden light. And that he realized that the universe, he had a responsibility for custodianship to maintain the universe. And that was what he was going to dedicate himself to after that point. And so he developed Aikido as a samurai form, but with no conflict. It's only a defensive form. There are no true Aikido forms that are a way to attack. It's that you're taking the key and redirecting the key. And in the Japanese frame of reference, ki, many people refer to it as energy, but I was always told by my teacher, Masamurita, that ki, well, he says, well, no, it's the way in which energy moves. See, so it's and it's always curvilinear. The potency of power is a curvilinear line. It's not a straight line. And so why am I saying this? Because ultimately we have to take responsibility for the world in which we live. And if we're seeing conflict around us, we have to take responsibility and we have to be a source of harmony.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what you said about it being a guest, I would look at that from a couple different points of view, which is one of them is that you are a guest in your body. Your ego, your I am, is a guest in your physical, your etheric, your astral body. It's a guest in your sentient soul, your intellectual soul, your consciousness soul. And only when it's refined enough that it has brought universal principles into capacities that it can then go as a guest from the body into the spiritual world. And we can also develop our three spiritual sides, our three spiritual egos, so that we can exist without a body in that world. And we can start doing that now through prayer and meditation, through basically consciously going into sleep and consciously working while we are asleep. And so we have to remember we're a guest. The I am is a guest in the body. As you are sitting in your heart, which is where your consciousness actually exists, your head's a mirror. It reflects all that the nerves tell us, but it's the heart that is the real consciousness. It looks down, and what does it see? That it's in charge of, it's a co-creator with, literally, they would say, anywhere between 10 to 100 trillion microbes in your stomach, your gut, from stomach, small, large intestines. And that is where actually they're now finding out, it's called the biome, the gut biome, that's where your consciousness has a tremendous foundation, where your psychological health, where all aspects of you come up through the intestines, your white blood cell, your ability to fight disease in your body, bad bacteria. So you're like a co-creator with a world of hierarchy above you, and what Tyler and I have now come up with a new word, the lowarchy below you. So that would be the microbes, that would be the flukes, that would be the worms, the intestinal worms, the all these things in you that are actually, they're living microbes. The enzymes that are inside of you that appear to be eternal as long as they're in a biological condition, that literally can do 1 trillion actions in 1 second. We are, and then above us, the hierarchy that we've been considering, how do we get higher consciousness? Well, first we have to be thankful for lower consciousness, and we have to be thankful that we're in this world. So the Greeks had a tradition, of course, as we know, that every time Zeus would see a beautiful being, especially women, he would come down and he would have to hang out with them. Well, the same thing was true for the northern people who believed in Odin. Odin was called the Gray Wanderer, who would wear a gray hat and a gray outfit, and he would have a patch over one eye because he had pulled it out to put it into the well of Mimir to gain wisdom, incredible wisdom. But anyway, the story is that his believers, his followers, he believed he was real, and he'd come down, and when there was a knock on the door, they immediately went into ecstasy, practically, at the hopes that it would be Odin coming in one form or another to share with them their dinner, to share whatever they had. And so they would treat every person with what they called unconditional hospitality. And so Odin might come in, and Odin might go and nothing happens. Odin might give them some kinds of blessing. Odin might come in and the house might turn into a whirlwind. You don't know. When you invite the gods in, you don't know what's going to happen, and you're going to be used by them. And you have to decide whether you wish to surrender to the higher forces of good, or you can surrender to the lower hierarchy, the lowarchy, to the forces of evil. And that's the decision. So what are you going to do? So when someone hears a knock at the door, the question is your I am going to allow in the hierarchy or the lowerarchy? And are you going to provide unconditional hospitality to whoever it is, whatsoever? And then the important thing to remember is that even though nothing may happen except that you give half of your last loaf of bread to this gray wanderer, the idea of this was an old idea, but it was trying to tell us what it means that we can allow higher and lower forces to come into us, spiritual forces, elemental forces, or even fallen hierarchical forces, whether you want to use the humorous term lowarchy or not. The point is there's forces of evil out there, there's forces of good, and you get to decide. But if you were truly Christian, you would treat them all the same. You'd be like the sun. You'd shine on everyone equally. And you would have love even for those who are difficult. For instance, with the Norse mythology, Odin in the end dies, and most of the heroes die. Some of their children live on, and some of the old gods live on, and they go across a new rainbow bridge. But in the end, some of the evil gods, Loki and the Fenris wolf and the Midgard serpent and Hela, meet on the battle in the battlefield of Ragnarok. And these gods and these elemental forces fight, and they mostly kill each other. And all that goes on is the new force of the younger children, or the young children of some of those beings. But they do go on to create a new world. So people shouldn't be so negative, even if we're looking at the fall of Western civilization. That's okay. All these civilizations have come and gone. And it is what we learn from them. It isn't them. It isn't the Norse. And I'm not saying that all Vikings or all Norse people who believe in Odin are still Viking warrior bankers. No, I'm not suggesting anything like that, because it's all melded together. And what we need to do is study all of it and then see how each of those components are parts of ourselves. And when we take that in, what are we doing? We're inviting the gods, even if it's the old gods, Odin, or the new gods, his children. When we invite them in, what are we really doing? We're inviting an opportunity to develop our I am, to take the next step in initiation. And that is really the mood of soul that I approach these topics with, because they're so utterly profound. And to even talk about them is to profane them beyond a shadow of a doubt. Though you can explain it in many ways, and we can draw analogies to science and things that have been discovered and so on and so forth. The point is, this is about direct experience. So to discover how you go from human consciousness to cosmic consciousness is a direct experience that only a person who has decided to become an initiate after the moment of illumination, and after sometimes many, many years of preparation. And in the old days, you had to give up many things, not only take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and not eat meat, and not have tobacco, and don't eat sugar, and don't eat beans, and You had to do all this preparation just to begin to see if you're ready for the golden moment of illumination, or that moment of enlightenment. But the deal is, you meet people everywhere who've had that moment, but then they don't know how to find a path for initiation. And that's the beauty of what anthroposophy and I would call it Western Christian esoteric path can present to an individual who's trying to do self-initiation, as well as you can find some people who acknowledge that, like my wife, Tyler Gabriel, who in her books on the Gospel of Sophia gives you a path of self-initiation. But it isn't one that, they actually give you a choice of them and then says, now you find your own. You can reach all of these things on your own. You don't need anybody to help you. But the second you get there at that threshold, if you go across the threshold, you're going to meet these beings we're talking about, and they become your teachers. And you'll meet your higher self, who is the master in you, or the female master in you, whatever you'd call that, I don't know. But whatever it is, this higher self that you have is your instructor. And that's what we've been trying to point out. Whether we're studying the pre-earthly deeds of Christ, standing upright, speaking and thinking, the gift of memory of Christ, the gift of the mystery of Golgotha, the mystery of the second coming of Christ, all of those things are inside of each one of us. And we can see it now. So we use our own body as the tool to see these higher elements, but they're not going to be seen as earth-bound, sense-bound thinking or anything that you've ever pictured before, because that isn't what they are. They're beyond anything that you can create a mental image of. But as John pointed out, that's the imaginal realm, and there's a variety of ways to get there. And the green snake and beautiful lily would be equivalent to study literally the entire Kalavala. Or as Rudolf Steiner said, if you study just one of his books, The Philosophy of Freedom, it'd be equivalent to studying his hundreds of books. And why is that? Because the process is about surrendering yourself, not only to higher beings, but to your higher self, and surrendering yourself to the world cosmic process. In other words, as John just reiterated, bringing Brahman into Atman. Atman is your third highest spiritual self. And Brahman, well, we call that the divine. You can call it Father, Mother, Child, God, Goddess, what, Holy Redeemer, whatever you call it, it doesn't really matter. Those are also components of yourself. And that's the beauty of what we're trying to get across. This vision, this movie we're trying to share with you, you don't need a ticket to go to. You already have it. It's in your heart. It's one drop of the etheric blood of Christ. And with that one drop, you can go all the way out to the termination shock zone and realize that the higher beings, who are all in service of the Trinity in Christ, are literally enwrapping us like this limit of our solar system that they think that they've found, which again is, you just have to laugh at all of this stuff, because it's like a child in a sandbox building a castle and believing it's a real castle. That's what science is. It's nothing more than sand on a beach that the ocean is going to erase. And so as we're looking at this, it's spiritual science, and that's what we're trying to share with you. And we're so fortunate that John and I have been studying Rudolf Steiner. I don't know, John, did you get your first book, Philosophy of Freedom, from your mother in the crib, or when was I can't remember when you came, you knew about Steiner probably before I did, which is a long time ago.
Well, I found out about it in what they now call middle school. We called junior high. And my friend, because you lined up alphabetically in gym class, the gentleman standing next to me ended up becoming one of my best friends, and he was a descendant of the Polish ambassador, and he had been reading Rudolf Steiner and Ouspensky, although I wasn't that attracted to Ouspensky. But yeah, he turned to me one day and he said, have you ever heard of Rudolf Steiner? And it was like a bell rang in my heart. I don't know how to describe it, but I knew that there was something that I was waiting for. And then it took a while to really fully sink in. And once I started reading Rudolf Steiner, they always drive me into a deeper level of myself, because I'd be reading and I'd turn the page, and I had already known what was going to be on that next page, even though I'd never read the book. So I guess there's some kind of association going on there. Whereas for somebody else, it might not even resonate at all. They might not even, Rudolf Steiner is not easy to read, like reading Plotinus, where you're reading a paragraph and you go, oh my Lord, this paragraph continues on the next page. It's like just these wraparound paragraphs that if you don't remember the content of the whole paragraph, when you get to the end, you're not going to have any idea what just happened. And so I have sympathy for people. But in keeping with what we've been trying to share with you today, this whole idea of mythic images, the poet Rana Maria Rilke, the German poet, in Letter 8 of Letters from a Young Poet says, how could we forget those ancient myths that stand at the beginning of all races? The myths about dragons that at the last moment are transformed into princesses. Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. So you see that you really do have an influence on your world that is extremely profound, but only if you accept the profundity. But if you do accept that profundity, even animals will do your bidding, because they will acknowledge Kyrios, which is your higher being is Kyrios. And Kyrios in the Bible is translated as Lord. And you are participatory in that reality to the extent that you are participatory in that reality. But if you don't accept it, if you don't take up the responsibility, it doesn't take place. And to finish a subtle detail of the story I was telling about the Aikido master and founder of Aikido, Murahei Ueshiba. But when that event happened, he was meditating under the tree, and the gold energy came out of the ground and surrounded him in a corona of bright golden light. He said, all the gods in the universe turned into purple smoke and entered my body. And then I knew that I had a responsibility to preserve the harmony of the universe. It's like, wow. I mean, I want to hang out with that guy, right? That's what you set your goals to beat someone like him, not some, I don't know, athletic thug, you know? I mean, really, and nothing against athletic thugs, you know, they have their place too. You got to love them, but come on now. I mean, it's getting to the point to where things are getting quite critical for human culture, and a very small amount of people can homeopathically maintain harmony in the universe. And that's all we're trying to do here, is homeopathically treat the world. And in doing that, I don't want to forget to share with you that the Gabriel's bookshelf is available to download for free many of their books. And their spiritual books are on ourspirit.com, but Douglas's books and Tyler's books are available on Amazon. And so you can go to the link below and you can click on Gabriel's bookshelf. And that'll enable you to download for free or get paper copies from Amazon. And if you want to help with my research, you could go to paypal.me/John Barnwell 888 and buy me a cup of coffee, or there's no amounts too small. And also there's a lot of links for Rudolf Steiner resources, but this podcast has been made possible by the generous support of Tyla and Vadim and Vivian and Neil and Christian and Mark, Maud and Druvman and Lauren, Paula and Rick and many others over the years. I want to thank all of them and keep in mind these wonderful words of Rudolf Steiner from 1914. They shine like stars in the heaven of eternal being, the spirits sent by God. May all human souls succeed in the realm of the earth to see their flames light. And there's also my books. I almost always forget something. And usually it's me. I forget myself. But my first book, Douglas wrote the foreword to, and it's the Arcana of the Grail Angel, 640 pages with a great many diagrams and extensive bibliography on the Grail path. And that's the study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the underground streams of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the true Rosicrucian order. And the sequel to that is the Arcana of Light on the Path. It's more of a meditative tool, really. But in there, I give you the complete series of Grail diagrams that are available in the first volume. Plus, I added a great many more. And so this will give you an ability to be able to keep all these complex subjects that we tend to deal with here, keep them organized and to meditate into them and to realize that what they are is it's a diagram. The diagrams are diagrams of the nature of your own being, that it's just a path of self-discovery that we're talking about here. And so in the spirit of Diotima and her dialogue in the banquet, and the banquet that is in the dialogues of Plato, that's the spirit in which we're offering these to you, that you might be able to develop that sacred, glowing warmth of heart.
Well, does that mean you're done? Because you mentioned the female teacher of Socrates, and you get me all excited, okay? Because now you're talking about anthroposophia, and again, looking at this. I'm not even sure what you would call her. She's like your spiritual counter image that is there and taking every step with you in your spiritual development, that records it all, that keeps it all, but is also a being that is evolving right along with humanity. These can only be found in the works of Rudolf Steiner. But when you then look in history and you look everywhere else in all the other writings, you'll find, well, others have had these intimations, but they didn't bring it into a cosmology, a comprehensive cosmology, as John was just intimating. That is the secret. If you got the cosmology, then hardly anything can worry you, because you know it's all going to work out. This isn't the end time. This isn't the apocalypse. You have to have more imagination than that. But it could be an end of a culture or certain cultural influences, and therefore we need new archetypes. And these are the archetypes that we know, or certainly we've already seen, become the archetypes that lead us into the future. And that is what humanity needs at this moment, is a reimagination that connects you to the higher aspects of thinking, feeling, and willing, so that people can start to become more moral, that they can think beyond the moment, that they can think beyond this one space that they're sitting in, that they can think of others, and they can think about the future. And if they do, it's very clear. What philosopher, what thinker, what theologist has not looked out on the world and come up with one single answer? They all have. And if they haven't, then they're just not very smart and they're just beginners. There's only one answer to this question of how do you bridge the world in your I am, and that's love. And please show me anywhere where anyone has described what love is, where it came from, how it works in the human being, where it's going, what it can do, why it's invisible, why it's eternal, and all these other things. No one. Christ has just simply told us that's the new law. That there's only one law, love. And so that's what we're describing here. But we're describing the love of an entire hierarchy that worked together through what the word that I like to use, heterochrony. In other words, laying down at different times different things as donations for us to use. So when we come as a guest into this body, it's because the hierarchies have created this body for us and still maintain it for us. Why? So that we can become one like them. And it's a very simple process, and it's impossible to articulate, and it's impossible, really, and I think you'll find this in all the traditions, that no master can guarantee that they can give to the student that wisdom. They could give them the love, the mercy, the grace, all the different things that they have to give, but it is up to the individual to take those steps. And that's what we're talking about, is how does the individual take steps towards their higher self? And how do you then unite with the world? How do you unite with what you would consider to be divine? And these issues can be explicated in history, and you can see their development. And through great teachers, you can see who all have limitations. Every teacher makes mistakes, and therefore you should listen to yourself. And even people would debate that your conscience can make mistakes. And so then they created a new word for it that would distinguish the part of your conscience that is infallible. And so that's what we have in us. We have conscience. We have literally the act of God or goddess in us. And then the question is, what do you do with it? Can you align your will with the divine will? And if so, do you have to surrender your own individuality for that? These are the questions that we're going to continue to wrestle with, as well as many others. And by the way, I want to thank Dr. Yuri, our friend, who basically asked us to do an entire biography of the I Am, which then led us to have to do a biography of Christ, which then had to lead us to do an entire biography of the cosmos, both cosmogenesis and anthropogenesis. And then Yuri the other day asked some even more deeper questions. And let me tell you, climbing this mountain is a very rigorous activity for an old man like myself. So Yuri, thank you for the questions. I don't know if we'll ever be able to answer them all.
Yes. When you return to the beginning of our little story here, I remind you that I was telling you about the bishop Ulfilas, who created the first translation of the Bible. He created the Gothic alphabet so that they'd actually have a written language, so that he could create the first the Silver Argentum. That's the codex that is the first version of the Bible in Europe, and you see in that Silver Argentum that during the 40 Years' War, it was stolen. It was kept at that time because it didn't belong to them, but eventually it ended up in Prague. And but during the 40 Years' War, was stolen and taken to Sweden and kept in the shrine of Uppsala. And Uppsala is an interesting city because that's really the sacred city of the Vikings in the north. And it's interesting because, really, when Ulfilas was transmitting the mystery of the Logos to the residents of the Goths, basically that's the relatives of the people who stole this Silver Argentum from Prague, and they kept it in Uppsala. And when it was put in Uppsala, somebody stole 11 pages out of the book. And it's funny, you're talking about conscience, because 2 generations later, a grand son, I believe, I'm sure it was a son or a daughter, but a descendant of the person who stole the 11 pages, had pangs of conscience and returned the missing 11 pages. So now the complete Silver Argentum is present in Uppsala, so that if you want, you can go look at it. But that's the Silver Argentum comprises just 4 Gospels, but that's the beginning of the impulses of Christianity within Northern Europe, other than the Irish monks that would come over, and they were able to transform Europe into Christian territory. So it's fascinating. History is far more interesting than some of these fabricated stories that we follow. Some of them are good to the extent that they have valuable mythic content. And mind you, there's a difference between Grimm's fairy tales and Hans Christian Andersen's, because in Grimm's, they were a transmission from the custodians of mankind. It's something that was given out from the initiates. Whereas Hans Christian Andersen, he did a good job, but those are things that he just made up. And so you have to be able to make distinctions between true mythic content or things that were made up that may more or less conform to the realities behind the mythic content. Like, for example, Douglas helping them create Star Wars. So that has a certain basis in a mythic reality. Or Tolkien. Tolkien had a close relationship with some of the ideas of Rudolf Steiner. He was not entirely unfamiliar with it because of Owen Barfield, who was a member of the Inkling. So it's fun exploring this world of literature that has been bequeathed to us. It's given us so much. And so it's in the spirit of that, and my bookish friend, Dr. Gabriel, and his wonderful industrious wife, one of the most industrious people I know. And I know a lot of people, although I'm a hermit, basically at this time, there's very few people I actually have conversations with other than like this. But that being said, I just want to thank Douglas, but I want to share with you again from Richard Wagner. And he says, Parsifal is on his way to the temple of the Grail Knights and says, I hardly move, yet far I seem to have come. And the all-knowing Gornemans replies, you see, my son, time turns here into space.